At the end of November 1944, the cannons in the Carpathians fell completely silent. The almost 3-month-long rumble of cannonade was replaced by an unusual silence. The incessant, menacing rumble of bursts was forever lost between those black peaks and the narrow valleys where the shadows of the mountains reign all day long. Now at last the guns were silent, and the silence of the forest was broken only by the rustling of the branches and the sound of the mountain rivers. Under the continuous blows of the Soviet troops, German divisions on the night of 26 November began to withdraw from the Carpathians to Przezov. The troops of the 38th Army, under the command of Colonel General Moskalenko, immediately began the pursuit. In the strip of the 1st was Czechoslovak Army Corps and its neighbour, the 67th Rifle Corps. There were fierce battles on 24 November for the capture of key enemy defensive positions that prevented the Soviet and Czechoslovak units from the Obshcheskoye Gorge area to the south. In the afternoon, the Germans were still defending on Obshara and Bezimianaya heights, but despite numerous hand-to-hand battles, they could not regain their lost positions. The end of the battle was approaching, and with it the withdrawal of Hitler's troops to the prepared defence on the Onava River. After the end of the battle, I was returning through the forest from the observation point on Kermika Hill to the village of Barwink, which was on the Polish side of the pass. The sky was frowning. I saw General Svoboda, in white felt boots and a grey papaka, with an inseparable stick in his hands. He was walking at the head of a group of officers to the car park on a beaten path along the slope of the Martinka Heights. On the way, the general turned round, waved his stick in the direction of Bezimianaya, shook his head and slightly audibly uttered 2 words. A terrible mountain. In these 2 words sounded all the gravity of the past battle for the height. After mastering Bezimianaya in the strip of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps, there was a temporary lull. The Soviet troops were completing operations to widen the breakthrough in the neighbouring areas. There was an unusual silence in the area of the Dueling Pass. It even weighed on me, and I felt out of place. In the course of tense battles, the SEALs had already got used to the constant rumble and noise, and now, in the sea of unexpected silence, I waited every minute for explosions and gunfire. Nothing of the kind, however, occurred. The temporary lull after the battle gave me a chance to think about many things. I liked such moments. The battles for the pass had not passed without a trace for me. I tried to make sense of everything and understand everything. I was experiencing the pain of loss, then dreaming of a peaceful life. The time was approaching 22 o'clock. From low clouds sowed fine rain. In the area of the pass slowly crawled clouds of fog. At this time, the Nazis usually began a disturbing artillery bombardment of Barwink and the neighbourhood. The bursts shook the ground so strongly that the plaster and soot in the log houses crumbled. My orderly Petricek from Vohynia seemed unable to be disturbed. He slept peacefully in the corner of the hut with his automatic rifle between his legs. We had already got used to this night concert. We were only disturbed by the occasional bursts of shells near the artillery depot in the village. That night a remarkable story happened to me. In the faint light of a small candle, I was looking with tired eyes at small markings on the map and preparing orders for the forthcoming battle. My work was progressing slowly. Suddenly I felt that there was a stranger in the room. I did not hear him enter, but my instinct told me that someone was standing behind me somewhere near the door. It was too risky to jump up from the table, and there was no point in jumping up, for I didn't have my gun on me at the moment, and it would be too late before Pietrzyk woke up and put his machine gun into action. The room, plunged into darkness, was lit by a small candle, so that only a limited space was visible. I was a little reassured by the guest's behaviour. He seemed to me too hesitant and unconcerned. But why is he silent? Is he acting for certain and mentally evaluating his chosen victim? A chill ran down my spine, but there was nothing to do. There was nothing to do but wait. Every movement and careless word could cause an unexpected reaction. What would it take to pull the trigger? At last I couldn't stand it any longer and glanced quickly to where the invisible stranger was standing. At the same moment he hurriedly stepped forward, and in the faint candlelight I saw the outline of a stocky figure. "My men thank you for your artillery support," said the man quietly. "I told them what you said before the attack, that they should trust the artillerymen, that they should follow the rampart, and then they would take the heights. They hesitated at first, but they obeyed the order, and it was exactly as you promised." In front of me, with a shot hand on the bandage, stood Captain Kunzel, commander of a special assault group, which yesterday took the Bezimiany Hill and thus completed the Carpathian Dueling battle in the strip of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps. The captain fell silent. His eyes glittered in the candlelight. I thought at that moment about those who gave their lives in that battle, and my joy was mixed with bitterness of sadness. From excitement I could not at once utter a word. We shook hands. I woke up my orderly Pechisic, and the three of us celebrated the capture of the heights in a marching manner. The night meeting in the village hut in Barwinek has always remained in my memory. In the early morning of 27 November, the road from the Dueling Pass southwards was already crowded with 3 rows of vehicles and columns of infantry. The vehicles and artillery of the units of the 38th Army and the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps advanced slowly, with frequent stops, and stretched along this single road for a distance of up to 20 kilometers. The army troops pursued the enemy in the southern direction. One column through the Obsharska Gap was heading towards Krajina Poljana, the other through Vladimirova towards Svidnik and Bardejov. The Czechoslovak units followed the eastern route through Bodrogota to Mirlia and Stropkov. Retreating, the enemy destroyed bridges and mined roads. In conditions of heavy rains and continuous fighting with enemy machine gunners who were covering the withdrawal of their main forces, our infantry moved very slowly. The sappers had to eliminate extensive mine barriers, repair blown bridges and lines of communication for artillery. But there were few sappers, so the artillerymen, following the infantry, cleared their way with their own forces. On the way of their advance, now and then met water obstacles, hindered by ice and mud. General Svoboda left at daylight, and I with my car got stuck behind Vyshny Kamanik and, taking into account my experience, decided to continue on foot. Together with Pietrike moved on our route. Moving to the new command centre, I tried to see the places of the past battle as closely as possible. On the way I stopped more than once, remembering the recent great and at the same time sorrowful events. About 20 meters from the borderline, which ran along the pass, I suddenly saw a small fenced-in mass grave. Here lay the soldiers of our corps who had fallen in the last battles. I could not believe that the earth had received them only recently. It was sad to stand by their grave at this unfriendly hour. The threat of the many faces of death hung over all of us all the time. It was tearing from our ranks, dear people, and yet everyone wanted to hope that he would be luckier than those who were no longer alive. Paying tribute to the fallen, I sadly put a sprig of fir tree on the grave of the commander of the 1st Brigade, General Vedrala Sazovsky, and moved down the Duklinskaya Road. This road has seen a lot of history. In 1799 and 1806, Russian troops under the leadership of Suvorov and Kutuzov marched here to meet Napoleon. On the same road, they returned back and stopped for a while in the town of Krosno, which again reminded of itself after the Carpathian Duklinsky battle in the autumn of 1944. When we passed through the lower Kamanik towards Krajina Poljana, there were burials of those who had been killed in the battles. Now the place was quiet, but during the October battles the village had been badly damaged by fire. The fire rose high to the sky, and nobody put it out, nobody saved property or complained about the misfortune. The acrid smoke drifted down the narrow valley for a long time, forming a persistent smoke screen. Every night, the sentries of the warring parties dived into it and fought bloody duels among the ruins. More than once I wondered how these old picturesque wooden churches of the Svidnika region managed to survive. The church in Lower Kamanik, a beautiful monument of folk architecture, was in the thick of the battle for 2 months and was not damaged. I remembered how at dawn on the 21st of November, we stood with Pechikek under the saving vaults of the church, going to get to the Bezimayanaya hill where the battle was going on. Mount Obshar, that formidable peak, had also now fallen silent. True, even now its appearance was far from welcoming. We tried to turn away from it as soon as possible. Under Bezimayanaya, carefully crossing the hastily made crossing over the destroyed bridge, I headed from Krypa Polyana to the shell-shattered village of Bodrujail. The rumble of the recent fighting still rang in my ears, though the valley was now as quiet as if life had completely stopped. To the left stretched the summit of Bezimyanya into the sky. When I looked at it from this recently German side, frost ran down my skin. It was now clear to me that on its vast expanse and wooded slopes the Germans had sheltered a large number of troops in safety. The capture of this bastion had cost us much blood. The nightmare that had recently raged here had vanished like a fog that never seemed to exist. It was as if the past had vanished into thin air. Neither the gunfire nor the crackle of machine gun bursts could be heard here. The war was suddenly gone. In Bodrujail, too, it was quiet and peaceful, Something was different here. When I thought about it, I realized that it was this very silence. On a hill near the village, a small wooden church stood in its centuries-old unchanged state, in the midst of a sea of human anger and hatred. It was a centre of forgiving love. Everything in this broken, abandoned village seemed unreal. It seemed as if time had stopped. True, the ruined village had lost the intimacy that the quiet, thoughtful surroundings once gave it, but I felt from the very first minute that I had something to do with this village near the silent mountain. There was silence all around, and it seemed to me that evening that I belonged most naturally to this war-torn world. Something compelled me to stay here, to walk, to look around. The artillery was stuck in the mud and stuck by the ruined bridges. The guns were silent, so it was possible to stop. From the steep height of Herzevater, low thick clouds descended. The cold stank, and from Bezimanaya the wind carried the odours of the recent battle. Pechikiek and I took shelter in a dilapidated hut, the only one in the village more or less suitable for sleeping. The roof had been blown off by a shell, there was a draught through the broken windows, and the window frames flapped in the wind. Once inside, I looked around in the darkness. On the wall, skewed, hung an icon of the Virgin Mary with broken glass. German hand grenades were lying in the corner. On the table stood a miraculously survived flower pot, with withered leaves sticking out of it. Looking out of the window, I saw the deserted garden in the evening twilight. On the Yaruka side, a noisy stream with clear water flowed through the garden. The brook smelled sweetish odour of leaves. Towards nightfall, Soviet soldiers. Liaison officers wandered into the same hut to spend the night. They made a bed for us. As I fell asleep, I heard the babbling brook for a long time. A man can hear a lot if he manages to learn. Then one of the soldiers gave a muffled cry and woke up. After sitting up a little, he went back to sleep. And I lay with my eyes open and gazing into the pitch darkness, waited for something. I was always waiting for something. Those who have often avoided death, each time as if reborn and returned to life with even greater gratitude, and so it was with me. What to another person seemed ordinary, I perceived as a gracious gift. The next day Spacek appeared with a car, and I went to Gribov to the Chief of Staff. Before leaving, I stood and listened once more to the murmuring song of the brook near the ruined hut. And now Bedruzel was left behind. I suddenly felt a long-forgotten feeling of peace, as if someone had lifted an invisible burden from me. That long, dark night at Bezimanaya I will never forget. An unforgettable night. Behind the village we passed a German artillery column defeated on the march. The roads to Pistrina and Gribov turned into a solid mass of mud. Neither in Mirols nor in Pistrina did we meet a single living soul. The deserted, blue-coloured houses were sad to look at. After all, without children, without children's laughter, a village ceases to be alive. The Chief of Staff waited me. The Chief of Staff gave me an order to go immediately to Vislava to General Svoboda. In the morning an offensive was planned, and our artillery had not yet taken up firing positions, and apparently would not take them by morning. The situation was very serious. I, too, was in a difficult situation, for I had to set off at once and walk 10 kilometres through the swampy terrain in the dark, rainy night, without roads, without a boussole, and with the barely visible beam of an electric. It was raining incessantly. I went out of the barracks to look at the weather and immediately got my boots stuck in the mud. And such a road ahead, a whole 10 kilometres. It would have been possible to get through on horseback, but there were no horses in Gribov. They were all at the general's headquarters in Wislaw. What will I use to light the road? I asked the Chief of Staff, switching on the battery light that was going out. Hey, I have only candles, and you can't light them in the rain, he answered me. He drew my attention to the fact that there were minefields along the road, and that one of them, somewhere between Gribov and Olshavka, had not been demined yet. Realizing the risk I was taking, the Chief Staff allocated a soldier, Marco, with a machine gun to accompany me. He was a pale, thin and, as it turned out, timid student from Kosis who had volunteered for the Czechoslovak army. About 3 o'clock in the morning Marco and I set off. We were immediately engulfed by pitch darkness. I kept checking the route with the map by the light of a torch and rather intuitively determined where to go next. The map was quickly worn to shreds, and we were soon soaked to the skin. Sometimes we lost our bearings and started literally exploring and groping the terrain. The more tired I got, the more my imagination played out. A pole with a plank in the middle of a field seemed to me to be a signpost for the road. Eventually we lost the road. Marco started muttering something about mines, which pissed me off. I realized that he didn't rely on me, he was afraid. Following me, he kept his distance so that in case I was blown up by a mine, he could stay alive. When climbing up the mountain, Marco was noticeably behind. He was panting. Because of him, I often had to stop and wait. Finally, we reached Olshavka. It's halfway to the goal. In 2 huts, we could see a faint light. In one was the battalion infirmary. On the floor lay seriously wounded during the last battles on Onava, with severed legs, broken limbs, and bullet wounds. The room smelled of blood, and the muffled moans of the wounded could be heard. Some were obediently silent and looked at me with a resigned gaze. These were the so-called good wounds, and others were in for a quick end, as evidenced by hoarse breathing and bloody vomit. When I went outside into the rain, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had woken up from a nightmare. In another hut, an old shepherd and his grandmother were arguing by the candle. The Germans had stolen their son and daughter. The grandfather, grunting and breathing heavily, came out into the yard with us and showed us how to go on. Right in front of us we could see the precipitous peak of Osikova mountain. Marco was tired and had a cough. On the way he confessed to me that he had once had tuberculosis. It was not easy to dress Osikova, but Marco kept his strength. At 8 o'clock in the morning we were in place. I reported my arrival to the general just as he was getting on horseback. The general said he had given up hope of my arrival. If I had been a few minutes late, I would not have found him there. Then I would hardly have been able to find my way to the MP, which was far ahead. This would have made it difficult for me to organize an artillery battle to capture the bridgehead in the Stroshin area. Thus, our camping trip was a success. It was an example of successful orientation on the terrain in the most difficult conditions. After the operation, I had to return to Gribov for a few days. I travelled there on horseback, and on the way I decided to see where we were walking with Marco at night. What was my amazement when on a plaque in the middle of the field, which I took to be a road signpost, I read, the same signs were visible in other places. Our footprints left no doubt that we were walking through a minefield at night. Marco must have had a good guardian angel. Phosphorus against Czechoslovak soldiers. Having reached the Onava river boundary during the pursuit of the enemy, we stopped, as we did not have enough forces to force it on a wide front. The commander of the 38th Army ordered to carry out a battle reconnaissance in a narrow area in the Corps band in order to establish the strength of the German defence behind the river. This was not an easy task. The thing is that by that time only infantrymen had approached the Onava, having overcome mined areas and forcing water lines. Artillery was left behind in front of destroyed bridges and in swampy terrain. So the Corps commander appealed to the Army Commander Colonel General Moskalenko with a request to postpone the offensive operation for 1 day. On that memorable night of 29 November, we, whoever we could, stayed awake in the village hut in Wisława. Generals Svoboda and Klepalek dozed off, first sitting up and then lying down for a while on a bed of straw. I could not sleep, though the light of the paraffin lamp and fatigue made me drowsy. Would the batteries arrive in time? Would the artillery be able to support with all its might the infantry's hard fight to ford the river? Such troubling thoughts now and then came to mind. I remembered with what apparent displeasure the Corps commander listened to my report that the guns and ammunition vehicles were stuck on the roads in the mud, so there was no guarantee that they would arrive at the firing positions in time. But it was beyond my power to influence the situation. In the morning we breathed a sigh of relief. Both regiments of the 3rd Brigade managed to pull most of the guns out of the mire and reach the firing positions. The battle reconnaissance was to be carried out in the place where the Onava, squeezed by heights, forms a narrow gorge, halfway from Svidnik to Stroksin. The river washes here at the foot of a forested height of 230 metres with the eloquent name of Kastel. The height here slopes steeply down to the river and ends with a precipice. Later it turned out to be a serious obstacle on the way of the Czechoslovak infantry to the dominating height. According to the plan, the capture of the summit would have created a favourable bridgehead to build on the success. General Svoboda hurried the commanders to take all measures to speed up preparations for the attack. This haste, to tell the truth, we did not like, especially since all the facts indicated the need to postpone the attack for 1 day. The general apparently had his own reasons for disagreeing with this. In the end, it turned out that the attack scheduled for the morning was postponed because of impassable roads. It was not until about 5 p.m. that the 2nd and 4th Battalions went forward. This was certainly too late for the artillerymen to be able to effectively assist the infantrymen. The infantry were to run down from the heights to the river, cross it, ford it, and attack the wooded heights of Kashtel. We were close to this place at the NP and watched the progress of the attack. Everything was going very well. Our artillerymen were firing accurately. The infantry ran to the river, as in the exercise, and forded. German artillery was silent. It seemed mysterious. If the enemy could stop the attackers, the best place to do so was still the Onava river frontier. Around the infantrymen, geysers of machine gun bursts jumped across the water, but no shell bursts had yet been seen. At this time General Svoboda turned to me and calmly, with a satisfied expression on his face. "Well done. We have run through." Indeed, the infantry made such a quick dash that the enemy's artillery was too late. When it opened barrage fire, ours were already over the river and fought in the woods. German shells were thickly raining down where the infantrymen were no longer there. The offensive of 29 November 1944 went down in the history of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps as the battle in which the Germans for the first time used shells with phosphorus charges against us. Burning, snorting white-fire phosphorus rose high to the sky, illuminating everything around like Bengal fire. The ground was burning. It was frightening to think what would have happened to the infantrymen if they had been caught in the midst of this illumination. They would have been burned alive. Only a part of our infantry managed to penetrate into the forest. There it was stopped by artillery fire and counterattacks of the enemy. It was impossible to get to the top. It was hard to look at some of our exhausted soldiers who could no longer climb the steep slopes of Kash. Lieutenant Denzel, commander of the 4th Battery of the 3rd Artillery Regiment of 120 M mortars, was advancing to the top together with the commander of the battalion of machine gunners. The lieutenant told me later what a scorcher the machine gunners were in when the Germans started firing phosphorus shells at them. The fight continued until darkness. Flashes of shots showed where the fire was coming from and also where the hand-to-hand fight was breaking out. Lieutenants Svitek and Sterk fought especially bravely. These young officers, only recently graduated from the Soviet school, died a death of bravery in this battle. At night, the infantry moved back behind the river. The corps commander ordered to stop further attacks. Attempts to force the Onava and break through the enemy defence line on the western bank of the river did not yield any results on other parts of the 38th Army front. The army troops, as well as the Czechoslovak Army Corps, were badly exhausted after 3 months of fighting in the harsh conditions of the Carpathians and in inclement weather, so until half of January they were on the defensive along the Onava. Mines, 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 mines E. On the 2nd of December 1944, I found myself in the village of Hocha near Stropkov. The village was completely burnt out. From wooden houses only cookers were left. Smoky chimneys protruded lonely against the sky. Old women in woolen shawls, powerless in their grief, stood silently in motionless poses near the fires. They threw at me piercing glances that spoke of extreme despair. The women of Hochi, once so sweet and cheerful, now stood with eyes inflamed with tears, but no longer able to cry. Behind the village lay the carcasses of dead cattle. By the fire sat a group of Soviet soldiers. In their hands they had letters from their homeland. It was raining and snowing and all around water, swamps and continuous mire. On the 4th of December, the Corps headquarters moved from the Polish village of Barwink to Wielkie Bukowice near Stropkow. This large village, which had not been damaged during the fighting, was now in a very difficult position. The Germans had mined all its neighbourhood with diabolical sophistication. In this village alone, the sappers disarmed up to 5,000 mines immediately after the entry. On re-inspection, another 1,600 different explosive devices were seized. It seemed that there would be no end to it. Every now and then explosions were heard, and each such case ended tragically. The number of victims was growing, and there were more and more fresh graves. One soldier had his leg blown off by a mine. Another his arm, a third was blown to pieces. I remember one soldier went to the barn to get hay. I shouted to him to be careful, but he waved it away. A second later there was an explosion and screams. The soldier's arm was torn off and his eyes were blown out. In the garden under the school windows, 3 unexploded bombs were sticking out of the ground. It was not pleasant to look at them. Near them, school notebooks were lying in a puddle. I picked up Marushka Venshishina's notebook and flipped through the pages. God knows what fate had befallen this 8-year-old girl. The smooth handwriting as if opened before me a trembling child's heart, and at least for a minute made me forget about the war, about the bombs sticking out of the ground. Hitlerites often mind also are killed or wounded, who temporarily found themselves on the territory occupied by the enemy or where his reconnaissance groups penetrated. As a result, sensitive losses were incurred by medical soldiers when they rendered first aid and funeral teams when evacuating the fallen from the battlefield. Snowfall posed a particular danger. The Nazis mined the area around the front line usually at night. They had no need to bury the mines. It was enough just to stick them in a snowdrift, and the snowfall did the rest. The snow that fell on Onava proved fatal for Captain Nosik and the 3 Soviet officers he accompanied on a trip along the front line. No one knows which of them was the first to step into the minefield covered with freshly fallen snow. However, when the other officers rushed to the aid of the first wounded man, they all blew themselves up too. The Nazis carried out the mines with all sorts of tricks. Some anti-tank mines exploded only after being hit repeatedly, and many of them were connected with artillery shells. The enemy also left various insidious traps in houses. Mines turned up in beds, in cookers, under windows, in woodsheds, in haylofts, in polished boots, in lavatories, under stairs, behind doors, etc. None of us could feel safe. We lived like a powder keg. On the Onava River. On 28 November 1944, after reaching the left bank of the Onava River, the long bloody battles for the Carpathians, for the first meters of the liberated homeland, came to an end. The Soviet army at this period was already preparing for a major winter offensive on a broad front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. The strip of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps was thus in a secondary direction, so its switch to defence on the Onava River was justified. Starting from December 6, 1944, the Corps defence line was gradually extended and reached 38 kilometres along the line Siakania, Vyshny, Orlik, Svidnik, Strosin, Stropkov, Breznica. On this very long line, 6 battle-weary infantry battalions were positioned, supported until 19 December by artillery units of our brigades and corps. Wide, but insignificant in depth, the battle order of the corps was not continuous. It consisted of a sparse network of defence nodes, the gaps between which were guarded by sentries. The leading edge of our defence in important directions was provided by minefields and wire barriers. The enemy, having broken away from the Czechoslovak units, withdrew his troops and took up a prearranged defence on the right bank of the Onava. The corps commander and brigade commanders had a lot of trouble in organising the defence of the 40-kilometre strip, as there were not enough forces for that. However, they tried to scrupulously calculate all forces and means, and to use them only in case of extremeness. At the end of December, almost all of the corps artillery was transferred to prepare the offensive north of the Carpathians. Only a small number of guns and 120 mortars remained in the corps. All this, of course, significantly reduced the striking power of our infantry. The situation was quite serious, because since the beginning of December the enemy had outnumbered us in manpower and equipment and had created a strong defence behind the river. There was a lull at the front. Nature had fallen into a thoughtful slumber, and it was not like that on the snowy terrain on both sides of the river. There were tens of thousands of soldiers who warmed themselves in dugouts and stayed near their equipment from morning till evening, armed with strong binoculars. They watched the enemy and from the surrounding heights studied every metre of enemy territory, but not a single living soul was visible. To avoid surprises, our units carried out intensive reconnaissance day and night and sent out patrols. The shallow river was no obstacle, and both sides sent reconnaissance patrols through gaps in the fighting order in order to capture towns and obtain information. A particularly tense situation in our defence, as I have already said, was created after the withdrawal of the artillery regiments at Jaslo. Constant sorties of enemy scouts and patrols, the daily threat of attack greatly exhausted the commanders and all. In these conditions, excellent camouflage and secrecy played an important role, for any neglect of the enemy had to pay the price. I remember a case near Stropkov. During reconnaissance, we carelessly gave ourselves away while moving from one height to another. The ground around us was suddenly shaking, trees were falling, broken branches were flying in the air. We were hit by an avalanche of deafening rumbles of bursts. We lay down and the enemy's fire intensified. Artillery shells began to burst, located somewhere far behind the front lines. Fearing injury, I pressed my face to the ground and, to distract myself, began to look at the pieces of clay sticking out in front of my eyes. It gave off an inherent odour and was overpoweringly attractive. And the monstrous nightmare did not stop. When I lifted my head for a second, I saw hunched figures running across the field, rumbling with ruptures. It seemed surprising that the scouts had not lost their bearings, for in this light martyrdom they had kept to the direction to the back slopes of the heights. There was salvation there. Up to decided on a desperate step. I jumped up and rushed after the others, remembering that in case of shelling it is necessary to change the direction of our movement perpendicular to the falling shells. We ran sharply to the right. The enemy observer continued to correct the fire even after we had taken cover behind the slope, as if he had seen us and was following us relentlessly. We ran at our own risk from the heights straight down. When the shelling ceased, we collapsed to the ground from fatigue. The Germans, using favourable observation points, were constantly disturbing us with artillery fire. They were especially attracted by the flat section of the road between Stropkov and Hocha. It was impossible to pass here during the day without great risk. In an attempt to save a few kilometres of the road, I repeatedly skipped along this road. Forgetting the danger, I once nearly paid for it with my life. The enemy observer was waiting for such daredevils, and as soon as one of them appeared on a flat 2-kilometre stretch of road, he found himself in the pincers of fire. That's exactly what happened to us, while Spacek had been gurching by car towards Stropkov. The German was methodically narrowing the fork. The critical moment was approaching, when at the next transfer of fire and at the same speed of the car, we were in danger of a direct hit. At that moment, Spacek, on my sign, masterfully turned round, and we ran back to Hoch. But this did not discourage the German artillery observer at all. He added a fork, and the game of life went on. We were again carried on at the highest speed. Instinctively, I felt the rhythm of the firing and that the shells were about to rain down on us. We braked sharply. The shells burst with a flight, and the driver was already driving the car back again towards Stropkov. When the Onava began to freeze, new worries appeared. The ice edge formed along the shore was breaking underfoot, thus attracting the enemy's attention, especially in the silence of the night. The Germans immediately responded to any noise and rustling with fire. Good physical stamina and hardening were required from the scouts to wade in icy water and lie wet for several hours in the snow. Frozen clothes rustled as they walked, which helped the cautious enemy to follow the movements of our sentries along the shore. Sometimes it came to paradoxes. Such villages as Strochin and Mestisko, Strokkov and Koksha, were separated from each other by a single river. The river divided the lower Svidnik into two parts. The scouts of both sides entered the abandoned villages and Svidnik in turn, and often had fierce fights there. It happened that the enemy's sentries would take over the same house where ours were staying. The enemy sentries took with them everything that could be useful for the equipment of dugouts and dugouts. There were also specialists in tongues. They tracked down an enemy sentry and lured him into a trap. Hitlerites more often used another trick. Having cut the telephone cable, they then liquidated the soldiers sent to correct communication. Victims of such a trick were our girls' telephone operators. A special place was occupied by depth reconnaissance, which gave valuable information about the situation in near and far rear of the enemy. Risking their lives, our scouts more than once penetrated through the front line with a radio and extracted the necessary information. Major Billet, who came to us from Slovak partisans after 2 Eastern Slovak divisions were disarmed by General Mailer and Colonel Tolsky, achieved great success in this matter. The information which Major Billet transmitted by radio was very useful to us. Unfortunately, this remarkable officer and partisan soon tragically died. Information about the placement of the enemy's artillery was of great importance to us. On the secondary Onava direction there were no army sounding stations, so we identified German batteries in a very risky way. With the help of depth reconnaissance, the scouts were exposed to great danger, sometimes disproportionate to the result obtained. During the period of temporary defence at Onava, the units received new recruits who were trained in various specialties: infantrymen, artillerymen, sappers. In the infantry brigades were created sergeant schools, and in Hawaii even opened a school of sergeants, artillerymen reserve. It is true that while in the infantry units a short period of lull allowed the recruits to be trained somehow, in the technical units it was quite impossible to do so. During the short period of training at Onava, The soldiers of artillery units could not acquire even the most elementary combat skills, and most of them came to the units without the necessary qualifications. The sad consequences of this circumstance became apparent later. On 23 December, guests, members of the Slovak National Council, the highest political body in Slovakia, came to Bukovci, where the Corps headquarters was located. Along with other issues they came to discuss, also the reasons for the defeat of the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the East Slovak Corps, to establish the guilt of the commanders in this catastrophe. I participated as a secretary in the meetings of the commission which interrogated Colonel Tolsky, the former deputy commander of the Eastern Slovak Corps, General Malar. Tolsky was accused of having shown indecision at a critical moment. Instead of taking a circular defense on the Duklinsky Pass together with his corps units and waiting for the Soviet troops to arrive, he flew to Lvov to marshal Konev, ostensibly to coordinate the actions of the Eastern Slovak Corps with the Soviet army units. That night Tolsky came to me. Of course, there was no time to sleep. All night long we argued heatedly. Tolsky stubbornly defended his position. A month passed. Christmas came. I met him in Wielkie Bikowiec in the abandoned schoolmaster's house. Our women from the headquarters put up a beautiful Christmas tree for me, and I sat by it all alone and remembered my loved ones. My firstborn son, Fred, was at the front, somewhere near Dunkirk. My wife and Milan were living near London at the time and were very much looking forward to our return. The time was approaching 9 o'clock in the evening. At one time we had agreed with Frantiska that at this hour on Christmas Eve we would remember each other and look at the polar star. We believed that our gazes would meet. That was our hope, that we would meet soon. I went outside. There was Christmas silence all around. The night was dark, and Polaris was not shining. However, I knew its exact location and turned my head in that direction. With a sense of excitement, I thought of the meeting of our gazes in infinity and of our soon meeting in the new world. On the eve of the breakthrough at Jaslow, at the end of December 1944, preparations were underway for one of the biggest battles of the past war. By this time, the Soviet-German front had established itself along the line north of Tilsit, Lomja, east of Warsaw, the Wisła River. Warsaw, Vistula River, Sandomir, Jaslow, Duklinsky Pass, Onava River, Kosice, Lusanek, and further south through Hungary to the border of Yugoslavia. The main goal of the forthcoming offensive operations was to break the German defence as a result of the efforts of the 5 fronts between the Baltic and the Carpathians, and, having made a decisive throw, to enter the territory of Germany. It was to defeat Hitler's troops in East Prussia and Poland, to clear Poland of German occupants, and to create conditions for the capture of Berlin and the end of the war. At the same time, the Soviet troops were preparing for the offensive in the Western Carpathians. The troops of the First Ukrainian Front under the command of Marshal Konev were on the important strategic direction leading from the Sandomir bridgehead to Radom and Breslau. This included the direction of Jaslow-Gorlice, Nauli, Sachs, where the 38th Army, under the command of Colonel General Moskalenko, hero of the Soviet Union, was advancing, operating on the left wing of the front along the northern foothills of the Carpathians. This army was to ensure the rapid advance of the main group of troops of the First Ukrainian Front in the direction of the main strike. The Soviet Army Command had concentrated a huge mass of troops and military equipment between the Carpathians and the Baltic. A total of 21 General Army, 5 tank armies, 9 tank, 2 mechanized and 3 cavalry corps opposed the large grouping of the enemy here. As a result of such concentration of forces and means on the main strike directions of a number of fronts, the Soviet army achieved a significant superiority over the enemy both in the number of infantry, artillery and tanks. 2 powerful offensive operations, East Prussian and Vistula Oder, were scheduled to begin on 20 January 1945. In reality, however, they began earlier than planned. This was done at the request of the Western powers. In mid-December, Anglo-American troops in the Ardennes were defeated by a counterattack of the Nazi Wehrmacht. They were threatened with encirclement and annihilation. On 6 January, Churchill and Roosevelt asked to accelerate preparations and begin early winter offensives of Soviet troops. On January 7, 1945, Stalin sent a reply letter, which in particular reported that the Soviet Supreme High Command, taking into account the situation of the Allies, at an increased pace, and not considering the weather, is preparing a broad offensive against the Germans along the entire Central Front no later than the second half of January. although the weather is not favourable to this offensive. To fulfill the new task assigned to the 38th Army, to break through the strong German defence and to advance in the direction of Jaslo-Goris, now Isaks, without allowing large losses in manpower, it was necessary to destroy all pockets of resistance, destroy trenches, shelters, positions of guns and tanks buried in the ground, and all other pre-prepared defensive structures of the enemy, as well as to destroy his manpower. All this required the concentration of the maximum number of artillery barrels, pulling them from other parts of the front. At dawn on 12 January 1945, the troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front, located on the left bank of the Vistula River near Sandomir, by order of the Soviet Supreme Command, took the offensive. The 38th Army, which was part of the front, continued to remain in place. On 15 January, its troops also began the offensive. The Czechoslovak artillerymen tankers of the 38th Army also fulfilled their task with honour. The small Polish town of Jaslo, located in the northern foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, took a prominent place among the many glorious battlefields where Czechoslovaks fought during the Second World War. In the area of this town, on 15 January 1945, the artillerymen of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps took part in the beginning of the grandiose winter offensive of the Soviet troops, having lost its remaining tanks in the battles for the Dukla Pass on 30 September. The 1st Czechoslav Tank Brigade was replenished with new equipment, and the first 8 tanks took part in the breakthrough at Jaslo. Abandoned infantrymen. A frowning quiet morning of 18 December 1944 at Onava, all around complete calmness. The Corps headquarters in Wielki Bukowiec showed no signs of active preparation for anything. Suddenly, as if out of the blue, from the 38th Army headquarters came an urgent cipher ordering to redeploy all 5 artillery regiments of the Corps to the area west of Krosno from 19 to 22 December. Only the purpose and tasks of the redeployment were kept in strict secrecy. Only the representatives of the Corps command knew about them. At first this order seemed incredible to the Corps commander and his assistants. It simply shocked them. How could it be imagined that the infantry defended on Onava completely alone, without artillery? Is it even possible to allow such a risk? But there was nothing to be done. The order came from the Army headquarters and was not subject to discussion. It should be recalled that the Corps suffered significant losses during almost 3 months of very heavy fighting in the Carpathians and was unable to conduct active combat operations. It had retained its entire striking force and was therefore the backbone of the Onava defence, and now this artillery was to be moved far to the north of the Carpathians. Thus the Corps units, deprived of the support of our powerful artillery, were at great risk. The only hope was that the artillerymen would be able to conceal their withdrawal from the enemy and skillfully misinform him of the true situation. The key to the success of this daring manoeuvre was in the hands of the artillerymen themselves. If the Nazis succeeded in establishing the fact of the artillery withdrawal, there was a real threat. A superior enemy would seize the favourable opportunity, break through the weak defences of the 1st and 3rd Brigades, encircle and destroy our units. On the one hand, the situation demanded to carefully disguise the withdrawal of the batteries, and on the other hand, by means of well thought-out and systematically conducted disinformation measures, to create an impression of strengthened defence at Onava. The Corps sapper units set up models of tanks and guns, deliberately poorly camouflaging them. Fires were lit in the forests, stoves were heated in the houses at dawn. Sawdust and rafts made of bridge logs were floated down the Hotchanka River. At night, cars were driven towards the front with their headlights switched on or half-dimmed, tank engines were started, etc. All these purposeful and planned activities were intended to give the enemy the impression that we were preparing an offensive operation. A serious problem turned out to be the movement of the artillery battle orders. After all, to order one thing and to fulfill another. The difficulty was to practically conceal the departure of artillery and to ensure its redeployment in conditions of the strictest secrecy. There were enormous difficulties here. Just at this time there was a sudden warming. The roads had become so muddy that it was difficult to move along them, and they were under continuous enemy observation and fire. It was especially difficult to get the guns out of their firing positions, as the terrain outside the roads became difficult to traverse, turned into a swamp, and the wheels of the guns were buried in the mud up to the axle. In addition, The order stipulated that the redeployment should be carried out at night without lighting, so as not to attract the attention of the enemy. Since it was impossible to move in the mud without turning on the engines of the tractors at high revolutions, their noise had to be drowned out by the firing of the guns. In some places, the soldiers had to help pull heavy guns and ammunition vehicles out of the mire knee-deep in mud. Despite all the difficulties, we managed to successfully cope with the task of redeployment of artillery. It was carried out on time, without losses, in complete secrecy. At the defensive positions on Onava, in order to mislead the enemy, 1 or 2 guns or mortars of all calibers were left from each regiment, which roamed from place to place, observing the previous mode of firing. This helped to give the enemy the impression that there had been no change in the artillery fighting order in the corps strip. In addition, artillerymen, together with sappers at the firing positions from which the equipment left, set up models of guns, as occurred second time through the Carpathians. Again in the last 2 months, this time in the opposite direction, the artillerymen of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps traversed the familiar Carpathian peaks. During the winter nights from 19 to 22 December, long columns of artillery regiments stretched from the Onava area up to the Dueling Pass. Behind Studený Vrch, they were met on the pass by a piercing wind with snow. The wind was hitting them mercilessly in the face, covering the low ridge with snow. Nothing could be seen round about but a continuous snow veil. The columns passed Barvinik, where the headquarters of the Czechoslovak Corps had recently been located, and with difficulty descended the dangerous icy serpentines of the northern spurs of the mountains to the broken town of Dueling. Here rested the remains of soldiers of the 1st and 3rd Brigades, who had fallen during the September battles for this town and for the terrible heights, Height 534 and Girova Gora. Then the columns divided. Units of the 1st and 2nd Artillery Regiments headed for Jedlice near Jaslo. The 3rd and 4th Regiments deployed at dawn near the infamous village of Rokanki. The 5th Corps Artillery Regiment did not march over the pass. From Onava it went through Gawai to the line Chatizhny, Jaslinka, Raimau, and concentrated in the centre of the offensive line near the village of Petakovka. The march took place in extremely unfavourable conditions. The weather suddenly changed in the Carpathians. Severe frosts struck and a snowstorm began. Carpathian peaks and roads covered with snow became a serious obstacle on the way of our artillerymen. Besides, there was ice on the roads. The guns slid backwards or to the edge of cliffs and deep slopes. The march took place at night, in total darkness, and the drivers literally miraculously kept control of their vehicles. The men walked in silence, but their faces reflected joyful excitement. In the flashes of cigarettes in the eyes of the soldiers was visible enthusiasm, expectation of upcoming events. Private soldiers believed that the front would soon move westwards and they too would be closer to their native places. If we talk about the operation at Jaslo, there is still no proper assessment of the fact that the change of combat orders of our artillery at Onava on 1922 December 1944 and the march of regiments across the Carpathians were carried out in due time, with full secrecy and without losses, although this operation was carried out in unimaginably difficult conditions. If we take into account that for 25 days the corps remained at Onava without artillery, and, despite this, the enemy did not undertake any offensive action during this period, we should objectively assess the moral and professional level of the command staff and the degree of training achieved by the personnel of the artillery units of the corps. It is difficult to imagine what would have happened if the enemy had become aware of the withdrawal of the artillery from Onava. In that case, an operational defeat would have been threatened. 5 of our artillery regiments would have had to hurriedly return from Kroino to Onava to support the infantry's heavy fight, and this would have weakened the grouping of troops in the main direction of the offensive at Jaslo. This, however, did not happen. The systematically implemented measures made it possible for a long time to mislead the enemy and create the impression that preparations for an offensive were underway at the Corps' defensive lines at Onava. The safety of the Corps during the days of December and January depended on the artillerymen and sappers, who were masterfully able to conceal the change of battle orders and mislead the enemy. The preparation for the battle. On the first night after the arrival of our artillery regiments, in the designated areas southeast of Jaslo from each battery, were sent guns and mortars to selected firing positions for shooting. Engineering equipment of the terrain began. It was freezing and a strong north wind was blowing. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow and had time to freeze to some depth. without respite in the darkness, observing complete silence and secrecy. Reinforced calculations of the main guns and mortars worked hard to create firing positions and observation points. The soldiers' uniforms were steaming. Free from work personnel at this time rested in the nearby forests in unheated dugouts. A strict regime of secrecy was observed. In order to avoid demasking of the forthcoming operation, any movement during the day was forbidden under threat of court-martial. By 24 December 1944, all sapper work was largely completed, and on 25 December began to equip the communications system. Immediately after taking up battle orders, the artillerymen began target reconnaissance and preparation for firing. While the personnel worked on the terrain, commanders and staffs worked out the documentation of the artillery offensive. The depth reconnaissance worked with remarkable clarity. Higher Soviet headquarters fully informed us about the presence of weapons, equipment, and enemy disposition. In the next 2 days, the firing of individual guns and mortars covertly verified the initial fire data. A special place in the Battle of Yaslo was occupied by geodetic and topographical preparation of firing. In none of the Red Army operations in which the artillery of our corps has had to take part so far, there was no such preparation. Even in the Carpathian Duklinskaya operation, because of the lack of time and ignorance of the enemy, the artillery offensive could not be prepared with the maximum exclusion of subjective moments. Conversely, the preparatory period at Jaslo lasted several weeks, which made it possible to use purely technical methods in the order and planning of fire. The necessary raw data for firing were derived in the most accurate numerical terms from geodetic data and a dense network of trigonometric points. Success depended on the precise work of the artillery unit's computation teams, day and night. The calculators determined the raw data for firing on individual targets. After the battle, it was found that the targets allocated to our batteries were completely destroyed by accurate firing. It is a little-known fact that on the eve of the offensive, the Czechoslovak officers undertook to destroy the targets allocated to them. After the battle was over, commissions directly on the battlefield checked how each unit had filled its assigned task, how effectively it had fired at enemy targets. The results achieved in the Battle of Yaslo show that we can be proud of our artillery. In the direction of the main strike, the actual density of artillery along the front line reached from 210 to 250 barrels per kilometre. Only at Stalingrad, as well as in the Kiev and Berlin operations, was the artillery density higher. What it means to concentrate 250 barrels per 1 kilometre of the front. I saw the next day after the occupation of the fighting order of the artillery group of the 38th Army. The battery was 100 metres away from the battery in front and in depth. The battery was firing in the gaps between the guns in front, and this carried a safety hazard for the calculations. Never before had we seen such a concentration of artillery. A total of 1443 guns and 120 mm mortars were concentrated in the breakthrough area, but nothing outwardly gave away such a large number of military equipment as the whole area was skillfully camouflaged by the snow cover. In this mass of guns and mortars, our 5 artillery regiments seemed simply lost, but the example of Jaslo showed that the support of 5 artillery regiments contributed greatly to the success of a major battle. In short, our help in artillery support of the offensive was substantial. The 148 guns and mortars of your regiments accounted for about 10% of the total number of guns drawn to the breakthrough area. This meant that every minute 148 Czechoslovak barrels were firing up to 600 shells and mines at enemy targets. This certainly meant something. The Meteorological Service was also involved in refining the data for firing. In the last 24 hours, incoming weather reports were regularly taken into account when adjusting the initial data received earlier. As it turned out later, the force of the strike shocked the enemy. 2 infantry divisions and 1 grenadier regiment of the enemy were defending on almost treeless and advantageous for defence heights east of the Wisloka River near Jaslo. On the eve of the offensive, there was a relative calm on the front. The enemy showed insignificant activity, opening in one place and in another dense artillery fire on our communications, detected firing positions and Ps and supposed concentrations of infantry, and Hitlerites systematically carried out clearing of the defence area, burned and blew up houses in villages and in Yaslo itself. Before the batters, the Germans razed to the ground almost 97% of the town's housing stock, apparently expecting that the ruins would become a serious obstacle for the advancing troops. Thus, it was to strike a blow at the strong, deeply echeloned and strengthened for months of German defence. Troops of the 38th Army occupied in this area of the defensive strip of up to 35 kilometres. However, the main blow was planned to strike on a narrow section of the front 8 kilometres wide. It was here that Colonel General Moskalenko decided to concentrate his main forces, especially the entire mass of artillery pulled here from other parts of the front. Now it was a matter of setting tasks and their fulfillment. The commanders of the Soviet divisions and corps believed in the combat training and skill of the artillerymen. This was evidenced by the volume of tasks assigned to us, and there were many of them, and very important, because the success of the battle depended on their fulfillment. Tense preparation for their systematic, precise fulfillment required from each commander and staff worker the maximum of mental and physical strength during all 3 weeks of the preparatory period. And life went forward. Every night was filled with preparation for battle. At night there were works, calculations were carried out, and during the day travelled on the ground to conduct reconnaissance and clarify the details of the upcoming battle. I remember at the end of December I had to visit the mortarmen of the 3rd Artillery Regiment. Their mortars were buried and camouflaged on the plain near the village of Glinik-Marjampolsky. This area was viewed by the Germans from perfectly equipped observation posts located on the heights east of the Wisloka River. The Soviet front line was visible from there as if it were in the palm of my hand. As usual, I walked alone. Closer to the front edge of the defence, I descended into a long, shallow communication passage. My tall cap was visible from the trench, making an excellent target. But who, pray tell, would want to walk hunched so far down a trench when the front is silent? I could not go unnoticed by the enemy observers, but to my surprise not a single shot was fired. After the meeting was over, I visited the batteries, talked to the young soldiers, and went on my way back. The lull at the front bewitched me, so I climbed out of the trench and walked directly across the snow-covered field to the village of Potakovka. Just when I was in complete safety, the silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a gunshot. A lone shot at the front seems strange, even embarrassing, as if it belongs only in the noise of the cannonade. A few seconds later, a shell whistled through the air and exploded in the field 200 meters away from me. It's nothing, I thought. One shell doesn't make a difference, and calmly continued on my way. A minute later, another shell burst, at the same distance from me, only on the opposite side. This time the burst followed immediately after the shot. I became alert. It became clear to me that the crowd had caught sight of me and was planning to take me in a fork just for fun. The enemy observer was watching me quite closely. This worried me, but nevertheless I continued to advance. I doubt if that scoundrel will waste shells on a single man in the middle of a field. I pondered, but the German thought otherwise. The third shell rustled over me and burst very close to me. I had time to throw myself on the ground, and very opportunely. Shell fragments whistled around me, some of them embedded in the snow nearby. That fool was a good shot. I jumped up and rushed towards a ravine in the distance. At intervals of 2 minutes, which were necessary to correct the firing data, the German tried again and again to hit me with a shell. And each time at the familiar rustle of a shell I ploughed my nose into the snow, then jumped up and ran as fast as I could out of the firing zone. Finally, in complete exhaustion, I reached the edge of a deep ravine and rolled down the slope. My strength was running out. My fur coat seemed especially heavy. I was mad with anger. Such insolence? No, the German would pay me for this, and very soon. I was lucky because at the bottom of the ravine I found the telephone exchange of the 5th Artillery Regiment, and the deed was done. The regimental commander, on my order, opened fire on the enemy telephone exchange with amazing speed and soon blew it to pieces with heavy shells. We knew the location of the enemy position. In the list of targets, it was number 56. We had destroyed an important target ahead of time, which should have remained secret until X hour. But I was avenged. The end of 1944 was approaching. It was a year of gigantic, bloody battles, a year of major victories for the Soviet army and crushing defeats for the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. 1944 ended the same way as any year ends, with a New Year's holiday. We met it at the front near Jaslow, in a dance hall in Krosno. The evening passed cheerfully, with enthusiasm. And why not? We were to go into battle. No one doubted it would be a victorious one. Only one thing remained a mystery. What would happen to each of us in this battle? The coming New Year promised a lot of hopes for the future, so the New Year holiday was mischievous, unusual, unique. On 8 January 1945, The order came to speed up the pace of preparations in order to meet the request of the Allies to start the Soviet winter offensive as early as possible. On the 13th of January, during the rounds of the positions, I was handed a cipher. With excitement I read, D-Day, 15 January. Our X was not indicated, but this would be known later. It was urgent to give a combat order. I sat down in the ruins of a house in the Polish village of Tarnowice, and on my knees quickly wrote the following oar. Our artillery has the honour of participating in the offensive of the glorious army of the peoples of the USSR. On its success depends the outcome of the war. This offensive brings closer the hour of meeting our relatives. The destruction and sacrifices that will still have to be paid, final victory will be less if we correctly solve our task. It selflessly help the army of our mighty ally, who is bringing us freedom and independence. Our highest duty now is for each of us to fulfill our duties faithfully. Remember the atrocities of the enemy, the suffering of our loved ones in our homeland, and the grief that the fascists have brought to the whole world. Fight and destroy the enemy with accurate fire. Success depends equally on each of you. I urge you all to fight for the speedy liberation of the Czechoslovak Republic and its people. I urge you all to spare no effort to reduce the infantry losses of the Soviet divisions supported by you, and thus strengthen the good name of the Czechoslovak artillerymen. Into battle. In a note to the order, I instructed the commanders to familiarize all personnel of our artillery units, concentrated near Jaslo, with the combat order by 24.0, including the forward observers who could only be reached at night without risk. Last action. Shortly after midnight on 15 January 1945 came the order to begin the offensive. It's 1. Artillery preparation in accordance with the original plan begins at 8.45 on 15.1 1945. 2. Infantry attack at 9:15 1945. Early in the morning I left Krosno for the NP near Jaslo, located at marker 341. On the way we overtook endless columns of all kinds of troops of the 101st and 67th Rifle Corps. Since midnight the troops were already moving to the starting lines for the offensive. The night was quiet and dark. No one in the car did not utter a word. Wrapped up in warm half-coats, everyone was immersed in his own thoughts. At this hour, 1,000 miles away, my wife and son are sleeping in a foreign country, involuntarily occurred to me. As I approached my destination, my excitement grew. Suddenly a soft, melodious song was heard in the car. Someone in a lyrical tenor sang a tender Soviet song about the front spring. The song carried over the columns of infantry and steel equipment. Nightingales, nightingales, don't disturb the soldiers. Let the soldiers get some sleep. Then the tenor fell silent. The soldiers continued to walk in silence in the dark gloom. Only our engine was muttering its usual song. This incident is forever etched in my memory. The song was sung at that time by Ejud Pitska, a Shitaj, who was only 20 years old at the time. The last hours before the attack were full of drama. The absolute silence in nature was clearly not matched by the excitement of the men. Despite the order to go to bed, the soldiers were awake. At the firing positions all night long, debates were going on, and in some places songs were heard. The soldiers, gripped by excitement, never slept a wink. At 4.0 came the order to take their places. At 5.0, at the firing positions declared combat readiness. At 6.0, the personnel were informed at the time X, 8.45 Moscow time. The 7th hour of the morning. In the east appeared the first glimpses of the coming day. The commanders at the NP nestled into their stereo tubes and looked carefully into the dark morning twilight. The crews stood waiting at the guns. It was the 8th hour of the morning, and the surrounding countryside was still shrouded in a sleepy silence. Nothing foreshadowed that soon hell would break loose here. At 8.0, the batteries received final adjustments to the initial data based on the latest meteorological information. At 8:30, the commanders received reports on the readiness of the batteries to open fire. Soon the command charge was given. Finally came the moment when the throats of thousands of people thundered out fire. In a few minutes, the artillerymen threw off their overcoats, then their tunics. Many began to take off their shirts. The rumble drowned out the shouts of commands, but there was no need for them. The calculations acted like fine-tuned machines at high speed. In the course of their training, they had achieved such skill, accuracy, and speed that they were not hindered even by the morning twilight, smoke, and dust. The signal for the beginning of the artillery, preparation was the Katyusha salvo. At first, Hitler's artillery returned fire for a few minutes, but then became completely silent, which testified to the accuracy of fire from our side. Shortly before the end of the artillery preparation, Soviet bombers and attacking aircrafts entered the battle. Large-caliber infantry machine guns opened fire. The end of the artillery preparation and the beginning of the attack were also marked by a Katyusha salvo. At 9:50, after 65 minutes of artillery preparation, the infantry, supported by tanks, went up to the attack. The pace of its advance was quite high because the main resistance nodes in the first 3 lines of enemy defense were almost completely destroyed. Artillery fire was accurate. The German trenches looked as if a terrible tornado of fire and metal had swept through here. After the artillery fire, only groups of fascists survived, but even those were completely demoralized and immediately surrendered as prisoners. Powerful artillery offensive, rapid advance of Soviet infantry, and tanks with continuous and effective support of Soviet and Czechoslovakian. Artillerymen did not allow the enemy to strengthen in time, and in an organized manner the second line of defense along the left bank of the Vistula River. This line was quickly overcome. Around noon, the town of Jaslo was liberated, and by 15.0 the advancing units had already reached the line established at the end of the first day of the operation. By this time, the depth of the breakthrough reached 11 kilometers. The tasks of the first day of the offensive were moved. The operation continued. On 19 January, that is, 4 days after the beginning of the offensive, Krakow was liberated. However, the Czechoslovak battery did not have to accompany the Soviet infantry. After breaking through the main enemy defense line, a new task awaited them: to return immediately to Onava to support the troops of the 1st Guards Army of the 4th Ukrainian Front in the forthcoming offensive. The commanders of the Soviet divisions parted with regret with our artillerymen. Thus, the commander of the 70th Guards Division, General Gusev, said at parting, "Your cooperation with us is over. Give all your artillerymen my thanks and best wishes. They fought bravely. I will endeavour to have their merits noted in the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief Marshal Stalin." The words of fervent gratitude for the excellent cooperation were expressed to the artillerymen after the end of the operation by the commander of the 38th Army, Colonel General Moskalenko. He also sent a telegram to General Ludwig Svoboda, in which he conveyed to the Corps soldiers his gratitude for excellent combat operations on 15 January 1945. Our artillerymen received the highest praise in the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Red Army Marshal Stalin, dated 19 January 1945. The 2nd, 4th and 5th artillery regiments were awarded a high award. They were given the honourable name of Yaselsky. The day of 15 January wrote in golden letters a heroic page in the history of the people's liberation struggle of the Czechoslovak people during the Second World War. This day was rightly declared the day of the Czechoslovak artillery. In my front diary on 15 January, it was recorded. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I left on a Willis through Petakovka to the NP. The road to the front line is packed with infantry, tanks, wagons, cars. All this silent mass is slowly moving forward. It is difficult to understand where one part ends and another begins. People go slowly, with serious faces. The Germans are nervous. At times, not far away, sounds of explosions. At the NP, all in their battle stations. Parts are in a state of readiness. In about an hour, the cannons will start talking. 250 guns per kilometre of front. This has never happened before. The closer the time X, the more excitement embraces us. Through the morning gloom, there are indistinct outlines of the front edge of the German defence. A heavy dead silence hangs over the area. 8 hours and 44 minutes. 1 minute to go, 60 seconds. Those opposite us had 60 seconds to live, and nothing could change their terrible fate. At 8:25, a fiery scorcher began. The whole area in the enemy's defence line seemed to be burning from the bursts of thousands of shells and mines, a continuous wall of explosions. Katyusha salvos scattered fountains of fire, tracer bullets and shells of anti-aircraft artillery, and machine guns pierced the airspace above us with a dense network of fiery threads. Over the area of firing positions of artillery restlessly dances a yellow veil from volleys from 1,500 barrels. In the thunderous booms behind us, and the heart-rending rumble in front of us wear out our nerves. After 30 minutes, the tired ear perceives only rumble. It seems as if you are in some other unreal world. Large calibre overhead make all kinds of sounds. Large caliber ones grumble grumblingly and smaller ones pass hurriedly, with a rustling whistle. Into this rumbling suddenly enters the sharp sound of close bursts of German shells. In response, in the rear of the enemy spoke guns of the Army Counter-Battery Group, which includes our 5th Corps Artillery Regiment. The fire of the group destroys enemy batteries, command posts, communication centres, ammunition depots, suitable reserves. Numerous fires of crimson flames illuminate the murky, smoky morning. A gigantic, terrible spectacle. And what is your part in it? Minor, small, very minor, but necessary. In the midst of the fury of the raging elements, the danger of death recedes and the sense of fear disappears. In such an environment, it is so easy to die, so elementary that one should not even think about it. 10 minutes before the end of the artillery preparation, the intensity of fire reaches its peak. All guns and mortars are firing at the front edge of the German positions at a high rate. Now no one there will no longer survive. At exactly 9:50, when the fire is transferred to the depths, the infantry and tanks rush forward. They meet almost no resistance. Here they disappear behind the folds of the terrain, then the heads of infantrymen for a moment to surface and disappear. These are the first prisoners. There aren't many of them. What's wrong with you? I ask an 18-year-old German. He stands crying, eyes crazy. Taken hours. Taken Yazlo broke through the second line of any defense. The Soviet troops in the direction of the main blow advanced to a depth of 15 kilometers. The pace of advance is increasing. Rare small arms fire is heard from afar. When the Czechoslovak artillery regiments were leaving the Yasl plains, winter twilight was falling on the hushed battlefield. The area around was once again deserted and seemed abandoned. It was as if nothing had ever happened here. Absolutely nothing. At times thunder rumbled from afar, as on a sweltering summer night. The same day in the evening on my return to Wielkie Bukowiec, I reported to the corps commander about the arrival of the artillery regiments. He already knew that the Czechoslovak artillerymen had fulfilled their task with honour. Shaking my hand, the general said, "Thank God that you are here again. Now I can finally get a good night's sleep." To Bardejov. On the night of 18 January, the combat situation on Onava changed radically, having received information that the main enemy forces began to withdraw at night. The troops of the 1st Guards Army under the command of Colonel General Grechko, which was subordinate to the 1st Czechoslovak Corps, began to pursue. Units of the 1st Brigade after the liberation of Zborov on 19 January were advancing on Bardejov from the north, and the 3rd Brigade was moving towards the city from the southwest. After successfully forcing the Onava River in the early morning of 18 January, the soldiers of this brigade began to pursue the retreating enemy in the direction of Okrugel, Kurim, Bardejovsky, Nova West. They acted that day most successfully not only among the corps units, but also among the whole 1st Guards Army. Despite the extremely difficult conditions, 15-degree frost, mined roads and settlements, the units of the brigade advanced further west than the others, and by noon on January 19 came to a distance of 7 kilometers from Bardejov. They could have seized the town the same day, but the brigade commander, General Klapalik, decided not to send further the exhausted troops, who had overcome 35 kilometers in adverse weather conditions, fighting continuously day and night in the frosty forests. After capturing the village of Bardejovska Nova West, the brigade's main battalion camped there for the night. For this village, which was defended by up to 200 enemy soldiers from the rearguard supported by several guns and mortars, a short but hot battle broke out. It was a kind of duel between Czechoslovak 76M anti-tank guns and German machine guns and guns mounted for direct fire. A battery of our 76M guns dashingly jumped into the open field in front of the village, and from a distance of about a kilometre opened a devastating fire on the enemy's guns and machine guns. Everything was decided by seconds and accuracy of fire. Before the enemy came to his senses, the targets were suppressed. Above the outermost buildings in the evening twilight rose fire, sparks in the light of which Captain Schucher's machine gunners penetrated into the village and took possession of it. Spis and I drove up to Bardejov just as the commander of the 3rd Brigade was leaving it. Above the town the glow of fires was blazing, and suddenly the Renaissance town hall, the Gothic cathedral and the old town buildings around the square appeared before me in all their glory. All this splendour so bewitched me that I saw nothing else. The inhabitants ran up to us. They said something, and I could not take my admiring gaze away from the stone masterpieces. And all this Hitlerites intended to destroy. The driver Spacek looked at things differently. A wine shop was burning on the square. My Spacek rushed inside the house and did not appear for so long that I did not believe in his return. At last he came out all shrouded in smoke, carrying a vial of rum under his arm. Smiling sweetly, Spacek handed me his booty. His eyes were watering from the smoke and his chest was shaking with coughing, but he was nevertheless happy and excited in his own way. I still have that vessel at home, and when I look at it I involuntarily remember the marvellous monuments of antiquity that have survived in Bardejov. The columns of troops of the 11th Rifle Corps were marching westwards. Hotel Republic, town mills, and some trade enterprises, set on fire by Hitlerites at night, were burning down. People were getting out into the light from cellars. We had to increase the pace of the pursuit. A certain Mr. Platzal on the way gave me a piece of kielce and a piece of fragrant bread. We moved to Presov and further west. During the pursuit of the enemy I was heading towards Presov. I wanted to get timely and comprehensive information about the situation at the front, and this trip almost became fatal for me. We entered the village of Demjatar near Roslavais just at the moment when the enemy rearguard blew up the bridge over the river. The explosion tore off the roofs of the neighbouring houses, scattering them in all directions. In order to get past the debris on the way, we decided to go to the right of the bridge along the river. Not far away we saw a group of locals. Judging by their behaviour, they welcomed the appearance of the first Czechoslovak soldiers. Suddenly one of the inhabitants ran in our direction, shouting something and waving his arms vigorously. It did not look like an expression of joy. On the contrary, there was a look of fright on his face. As he ran closer, the words came to us. Mines, mines. You've hit a mine. We jumped out of the car and walked back along the snow trail. With our right wheels, we touched a hastily buried anti-tank mine, one of those with which the Germans had mined the objects near the bridge before retreating. It was enough for us to drive a few millimetres to the right, and there would have been nothing left of us. This incident had a funny sequel. We went into one of the nearby peasant houses. Suddenly a sapper ran into the hut. He advised to open the windows and doors, as the sappers were about to destroy the mines they had collected. The peasant flatly refused to let the cold into the house. Nonsense. He cut him off and waved his hand. His quarrel with his wife, who intended to open the windows, had not yet ended when a terrible explosion was heard, and all the glass from the windows and door partitions flew away. At the sight of this, the peasant woman seized a poker and began to run after her husband round the table, accompanying her blows with select words. We don't know the final outcome, for the peasant gave a hoot. This incident with the mines reminded me of another incident we had witnessed shortly before. That incident, however, had a tragic end. Somewhere near Bardejov we were catching up with a peasant's cart pulled by a pair of horses in our willies. On it sat the driver and two Czechoslovak officers. When the cart was about 300 to 400 metres away, there was a strong explosion. All around was shrouded in black smoke. Gradually the scene of the explosion became clearer. In snowy plain with a diameter of 100 metres around, we saw only a few dark spots and wheel splinters, all that was left of the 3 men and 2 horses with the wagon. On the 20th of January, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps left the subordination of the 1st Guards Army of Colonel General Grechko and was included in the 18th Army of Lieutenant General Gastilovich, with which it operated until the end of the war. The 18th Army was advancing from Kosis in the direction of Madshakani, Krompahi, Spisk Nova Verbs, until the end of January. The corps provided the right flank of the army, and although operationally it was an auxiliary direction here, every step forward cost us heavy losses during the fierce battles with the enemy. According to the directive of the 1st Guards Army, the redeployment of some units of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps to the area of Presov began on 20 January at 18 o'clock, with the exception of some infantry units moved by motor transport. Most units made a 40-kilometre night march in windy, freezing weather. After a short rest, a further night march of 30 kilometres began at 5 p.m. on 21 January. At dawn, on 22 January, the Corps units replaced the Soviet Rifle Division west of Presov and began to pursue the enemy in the direction of Spisk-Podredy-Spiskvahi. By evening, our troops, who had covered 70 kilometres on foot over the last 2 days on difficult terrain and in unfavourable weather, were very exhausted. Having come into contact with the enemy, who had created defensive lines along the eastern slopes of the high mountain range Brisco. Our units could not take possession of this snowy bastion without proper support. By that time, the artillery was far behind the infantry due to considerable difficulties in moving along broken country roads and icy asphalt roads. It was not until 23 January that the main artillery force took up firing positions in the Brisco area, but the attack launched at noon on that day was soon abandoned because of sensitive infantry casualties. The failure was mainly due to the fact that the soldiers were badly fatigued, and the attack from the front was not combined with a flanking maneuver. But the main reason is that the artillery did not have time to prepare fire. This battle left me with heavy memories. On a clear, frosty afternoon, the infantry turned in a chain near the village of Hradok, on both sides of the road press off Levoca, and on a snowy, bare field, launched a frontal attack on the mighty Brisco ridge. The Germans had few forces, but they had enough automatic weapons with which they successfully blocked all approaches to the mountain range. Their artillery was not silent either. From NPS located on the dominant heights, the enemy was correcting the accurate fire on our infantry. He could clearly see how towards the forests and steeps, as if on a training ground, moved small figures of infantrymen. Here they lay down, rose and fell again on the open white plain. This rhythm of movement first slowed down and then stopped altogether. The white field was thickly covered with black dots. Enemy fire pinned the infantry to the ground. We and General Svoboda watched the battle from the flank and made every effort to give the infantry effective support and quickly suppress enemy targets. The artillerymen opened a rapid barrage of fire, such as our guns were able to sustain. However, artillery shaft could not cover the infantrymen. The thunder of the cannonade seemed to have no effect on the enemy. All battalions soon after the start of the attack were stopped by concentrated artillery, mortar and machine gun, fire at the boundary of 200. 300 meters from the edge of the forest. Only the artillerymen on the NP know how hard it is to see one's own failure when one has to watch in impotent rage at one's own ineffective fire. To suppress the enemy, one must know his position. The only way to identify targets is through reconnaissance. All this requires a lot of time that will definitely pay off later. In the battle for Brisco, the artillerymen had no time to prepare for firing. The main thing was to move forward quickly. I still can't get the attack on Brisco on 23 January 1945 out of my head. The Germans abandoned these strong positions only after the 1st Brigade bypassed their northern flank, and the 3rd Brigade, with a bold covering manoeuvre and quick decisive actions again, launched an army-wide operation to pursue the enemy. This was also facilitated by the success of the Soviet troops, who, advancing along the Hornad River Valley, liberated Carpathian and moved further west. All this forced the Germans to retreat from their positions on the Brisco. Units of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, together with the Soviet troops, began to pursue the retreating enemy in the direction of Spis. Units of the 3rd Brigade occupied this settlement by evening, and, despite fatigue, together with other Corps units, continued to move towards the town of Levoca. On the only road from Spis to Podradai, a huge avalanche of men, military equipment and transport of units of the 1st Guards Army. 18th Army and 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps moved slowly, with frequent stops. Attempts of commanders to somehow dismember this crowded, poorly manoeuvrable mass and accelerate the advance of the column ended in vain. Only because of the lack of enemy aviation everything turned out safely. To Levoca and Kezmarok. The commander of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps wanted to be the first to enter the ancient town of Levoca. Units of the 3rd Brigade were ordered to advance on the town, while units of the 1st Brigade were to bypass Levoca from the north and northwest. The 24th Soviet Rifle Division was to advance on the town from the south. However, even on 26 January, the planned plan could not be executed due to stubborn resistance of the enemy. The next day, it was not necessary to resume the offensive, because the scouts of the 3rd Brigade reported about the retreat of the enemy from the Levoca area. In the afternoon, the 5th Battalion was the first of the Czechoslovak units to enter the town. At the city fortress walls stood General Svoboda. The exhausted soldiers tried their best to pass properly in front of their commander. The general looked at them for a long time and then silently entered the city through the gate. His face was sad. There was Levoca. It seemed to me that in this harsh world I was no longer capable of admiring the charms of antiquity. I thought so, but it was not true. When I saw the Renaissance town hall in the centre of the square, with its early Gothic tower from the last third of the 15th century and the amazing arcades on the portico, I was indescribably delighted. Not ceasing to marvel at Levoca's stone architecture, I walked round the town hall and stopped in front of the south gable, decorated with allegorical images of the 5 virtues. Which one shall I choose for myself? I thought. Apparently the third, it be patient, unfailingly courageous, confident in one's abilities and magnanimous in thought. Yes, that's certainly a great virtue for a soldier. Patience had not been discarded. Patience is the strength to endure pain and fatigue. This virtue seemed to me to be more significant than all the others, but on looking further I read, soberly and carefully test every endeavour. This is the truth. I decided and was about to leave, but involuntarily I read the 4th inscription. Justice is the virtue that rewards everyone with what belongs to him. Now everything became clear to me to the end, and I favoured this virtue. With the consent of the corps commander, I followed on with the 1st Brigade. After the liberation of Levoca by the units of the 3rd Brigade, the attack of the 1st Brigade, scheduled for the morning of January 27, was cancelled, as it had lost its meaning. Hired soldiers of this brigade moved to Kezmarok. Units of the 3rd Brigade headed from Levoca towards the High Tatras to clear them of the enemy. Around midnight, units of the 1st Brigade entered the deserted town of Kezmarok, travelling 20 kilometres along a mountainous, snow-covered road. For the infantrymen, the journey was extremely difficult as they had to continuously repel attacks by enemy rearguards. Advancing through the desolate Spis region, from which the locals, the Germans, had fled to the west, was like walking through a dead desert. And in this empty town, in the middle of the night, the bells rang triumphantly, heralding the arrival of the liberator. Kezmarok, the citadel of the German population in the Spis region, epitomized this nation. The solidity and arrogance of the town's inhabitants emanated even from the stone buildings they had abandoned. As these people lived and felt, so they built. As we approached the town, we heard the pitiful mooing of cattle. Each animal mooed in its own way, complaining of hunger and thirst. The 4-legged martyrs rattled their chains and looked out fearfully for people. In the once rich town there was not a single living soul, except for a few Slovaks. Panic gripped the Germans as the front approached. They had delayed too long, giddily hoping for a final victory. In the houses everything was left in its place. In washed dishes and undrinkable tea spoke of the haste in which the evacuation of the city had taken place. The clocks were ticking, though there was no one to tell the time. The time of their masters was over. There was a peculiar dead silence, a kind of vacuum of life that made me feel eerie. I was assigned a house where I could be accommodated. When I arrived there some time later, I found a guest there. A short man was sitting cross-legged on a large chair, smoking a pipe with a long pipe that reached to the table. Smoke seemed to come out of him from everywhere. The guest interested me. He was an elderly man with a cheekbone, yellow, parchment-like face. I was particularly attracted to his eyes, slanted with a searching, unblinking stare. At that moment, they were so preoccupied with something else that they didn't notice me. "Where are you from?" I began. Not a sound in reply. I guess he didn't hear me. "Where are you from?" And again it was as if he had not heard, as if he had frozen and turned into a porcelain Buddha. He was sitting, smoking and reacting to nothing. My patience ran out, and cursing, I left the house. The man was left alone with his pipe. The storm at Starbury. In the early morning of 29 January, units of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade reached the village of Starbury, where, without encountering any resistance from the enemy, they replaced units of the 17th Guards Rifle Corps. The unimpeded advance ended in the afternoon. A battalion of machine gunners and a reconnaissance company were stopped on a bare upland plain in front of the settlement of Vashets, as a result of a sudden fire attack by enemy self-propelled guns and artillery, the number of which was not established. Our units suffered significant losses and were forced to withdraw in a southwestern direction. At 19 o'clock, the brigade commander ordered the 3rd Infantry Battalion to make a new attack on Vazets. However, the new attempt to break through to Vazets, supported by several Soviet self-propelled guns, was unsuccessful. It was also hampered by extremely unfavourable weather. Just at the start of the attack, a hurricane wind had picked up along the Starbury Valley, and it was 30-degree frost. In order to stand in the wind, the soldiers went into the attack, leaning forward sharp. Hands, ears, faces were stiff from the frost. The wounded, who were not given timely help, died of cold. The tempest raised a prickly dust of snow from the surface of the bare plain and blew it on the faces and eyes of the attackers. I followed with General Svoboda in the battalion's fighting order, not far from a Soviet self-propelled vehicle. The evening twilight was occasionally illuminated by a flash of light, followed by the sound of a burst. It was a German self-propelled gun firing, or maybe a cannon. Suddenly the chains of infantrymen stopped for some unknown reason. An icy hurricane fell on the crouched figures of the fighters. It penetrated to the bones, breath was taken away. Many soldiers and officers turned white from the frost. The chains did not move, and the snowstorm howled, drowning out the words of commands. On February 2, having overcome the enemy resistance on the front lines in Liptovsky, Hradok and Podturen, our units approached the new, strongly fortified enemy defence line in front of Liptovsky Mikulas. Encounter in Podturen. Having retreated from Wojciech, the enemy took up a new line of defence 7 kilometres east of Liptovsky Mikulas in the area of Porubka, Liptovsky Hradok, Podturen. Overcoming this line as quickly as possible was of great importance, because the only communication route to the west along the valley of the Wag river allowed not only to successfully pursue the enemy, but also to liberate Liptovsky Mikulas and Ruzomberok more quickly. The command of the 4th Ukrainian Front gave the partisan brigade of P. Velichko the task to take Liptovsky Mikulas and Ruzomberok. Wielichko's partisan brigade was tasked to take Liptovsky Hradok and hold it until the approach of our troops. In the afternoon of 29 January, the partisans took the town by a sudden attack, but due to lack of ammunition they could not hold it for a long time. On 31 January, when the brigade commander gave the order to withdraw, units of our 1st Brigade penetrated into Hradok and together with the partisans cleared the town of the enemy until evening. Driving through the town the next morning, I saw many corpses in the streets. Everything testified to the brutal battle that had been played out here. Liptovsky Hradok was taken thanks to the combat cooperation of Czechoslovak and Soviet soldiers and partisans. Thus, the enemy's plans to suspend the corps advance by persistent defence of the town and to postpone the moment of the strike on Liptovsky Mikulas failed. In the future, the corps units continued to pursue the enemy in the western direction, having the task to seize Ruzomberok by the evening of 1 February. This task seemed hardly feasible, because, on the one hand, it was necessary to overcome 30 kilometres of mountainous terrain in one day. On the other hand, fast and continuous pursuit would not allow the enemy to move to the defence in the area of Ruzomberok. At that time, it was wrongly assumed that the main line of the Nazi defence was located there. As it turned out, in fact, the Germans had prepared a defence line to the east, lying on Liptovsky Mikulas and the commanding heights located north of the town. They cut the narrow Var Valley with a deeply echelon defence system, covered from the flanks by the impassable peaks of the Liptovsky Mountains and the low Tatras. After the fall of Liptovsky Hradok, the enemy fought deterrent battles 4 kilometres west of this town on the line of Podturen-Liptovsky Jan. A fierce battle was fought over Podgorun. From there we heard a strong artillery cannonade and machine gun bursts. I left the corps CP to Podturen to familiarise myself with the situation on the spot and report to the general. My conversation with him almost became the last. Near the railway bridge, not reaching a kilometre to Podturini, we stopped. The enemy was firing heavily on the village. A cloud of black smoke was spreading over the roofs. I left Sparse with the car, and myself moved forward along the embankment. Suddenly a few branches fell at my feet, as if cut from a willow tree in front of me. This was familiar to me. Immediately I heard the dry sound of a shot. There was no escape but to move, so I ducked down, and wagging as I ran, took cover in the nearest notch of the railway embankment. For a moment I was safe. Panicking around a little, I realised that I was in a trap. The enemy sniper was sitting somewhere on the hill above the quarry, where the railway turned aside, and from there he controlled both exits from the excavation. A snow-covered field stretched between the embankment and the village, with cornstalks sticking up. The silence was exploded by a new fire raid on the village. By the sound of the shots I determined that enemy tanks were involved in the shelling. Apparently Podturen was having a hard time, and I could not move from my seat. Only endurance can save. I kept repeating to myself, let his vision blur and his arm get tired, then not before. It will be my turn. But I did not know how long it might last. The sniper, as if accepting the game, fired a shot, and the bullet sank deafeningly into the embankment. He was making it clear that he wasn't going to let me out of here. I was terribly annoyed. It was unenviable. The general was waiting for a report, my artillerymen were waiting for their commander, and I was mad with anger thinking how to get out of this story. The case seemed hopeless. Until it got dark, I was never going to get out of here, but that would be too late for me and the general. Time dragged on terribly slowly. My thoughts were confused. My mind was a mess. A white fountain rose on the frozen snow of the embankment in front of the excavation. The sniper was not slumbering. It became clear to me that he would not be fooled. In general, today everything turned out to be surprisingly difficult and unsuccessful. Already in the morning, there was no doubt that the enemy succeeded in his plan to hold back our offensive. He maneuvered perfectly, acted quickly, assessed the situation well, and with his fire raids, repeatedly struck us in the most sensitive places. I was driven to despair by my own helplessness at the sight of such proactive actions of the enemy. At last I could not stand it. I run. I'll loop the Dan like a hare. Maybe the German will miss. But when I looked at the bare, snowy plain and imagined what would become of me if a sniper wounded me in the leg and pinned me to the ground by fire, my resolve shook. To overcome my fear, I thought of those who had fought in Poturan. It had not been easy for them either. At the same time, I was sure that the commanders I needed were probably in the village. I mind they all appeared before me. The energetic, taciturn chief of artillery of the 1st Brigade, Ota Reiters, his chief of staff, the always smiling Hendrich, the commander of the 1st Artillery Regiment, the correct Joseph Hradok, the commander of the anti-tank fighter regiment of the 1st Brigade, the desperately brave Shiner. All my friends are certainly there, I thought excitedly. At last I resolved to act. It seemed to me that a faintly visible fold of terrain stretched across the field from the embankment to the village. But will it shelter me from a bullet if I crawl? Won't a bullet hit me in the back? I peered cautiously out of hiding and instantly calculated the angle of fire from the likely lair of the wily sniper. And though a way out had been found, it didn't make me feel any better. I suddenly lost the will to get out. A new burst of gunfire helped. Sprawled on the ground, covered in snow, forgetting about the danger that awaited me every minute, I gathered my courage and crawled out of the shelter. The heavy coat made it hard to move, but its white colour camouflaged me well on the ground. I crawled like a turtle and could not see anything, nor did I want to. So, centimetre by centimetre, I moved forward across the endless field. There were huge snowdrifts in Poturan. Roofs, vegetable gardens, hedges, everything was levelled and sunk in the snowmass. In a few great leaps I crossed the shelled square, and in the full sense of the word found myself in the arms of my comrades. My attention was attracted by a sturdy one-story building. It promised a safe shelter and was the only one of its kind in the village. And so, out of breath from running, I sat at the window in the basement. Reitierge, Raider, Gendrich, Shiner, Quidoka, Thiara, and the others were there, tucked behind the massive walls of the house. They looked serious, subdued. The defenders of the village had already repelled several attacks by enemy infantry supported by tanks, and each time the enemy retreated from Poturania. Just at the moment of my appearance, ours were repelling the last attack. Following it, an avalanche of enemy shells and mines fell on the village. Those who were standing threw themselves on the floor or hid behind the wall. Only I continued to sit at the window with contrived calmness, and with fear in my soul watched the squat huts turn into ruins. And then I saw an unbelievable sight. In spite of the continuous ruptures, a Willies drove deliberately slowly through the village towards Liptovsky Mikulash. This guy must have a lot of nerve. I burst out in amazement. The car turned aside and everything went back to the way it was before, only the license plate number still loomed before my eyes. Having completed the task, I was returning to my car along the willow-covered bank of the Wag River. Spacekick reported to me that a car with our colonel had passed by him. I felt uneasy, because that meant that the colonel had driven from Poturini to Mikulash at a time when there was still a manoeuvre battle on the western edge of the village. How had I not followed him? Even in the morning at Gaib, the colonel had assured me, waving his hand vigorously, that at Liptovsky Mikulas he would be the first to go. The colonel did not return by evening to the Corps CP in Stepia, nor did he appear the next day. All searches were unsuccessful. Had he crossed the front line by mistake? At that time, we could not answer this question. So on 2 February 1945, I became Chief of Artillery of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, and de jure as I had been performing this function de facto, being the Czechoslovak Deputy Soviet Chief of Artillery of the Corps, since the moment of my arrival at the front.